Hi everybody. This week's topic is focusing upon centre of gravity and its relationship to stability, and of course how important that is to sporting performance. This is the last major topic area that is going to be crucial for your completion of assignment 2, your movement analysis group presentations. For much of this module, and certainly in the last session we did prior to Christmas, the major focus has been upon the production of forces. And I should also add the application of those forces. So via muscular contraction and its interaction with the skeletal system, we can produce a force, we apply it to the skeleton, apply it to the external environment, and we create movement as a result. And certainly a major aspect of that was governing the application of those forces, centered around Newton's 3 laws. Law 1 being the law of inertia, an object at rest will stay at rest until an external force is applied, or an object in motion will stay in motion until an external force applied. Newton's second law, which can be summarized by the equation force equals mass times acceleration. So the acceleration of an object is proportional to the force applied and inversely proportional to the mass. And then the third law of action and reaction forces: for every action force, there is an equal and opposite reaction force. Now, production of and application of force obviously is crucial for sport and performance. However, applying forces is not going to be effective unless we have a stable base upon which to do so. So there's an old saying, and it's illustrated on the cartoon picture on the screen. Now, you can't fire a cannon from a canoe. Okay, the idea of this is there is not a stable base underneath that cannon, so even that huge force the cannon is producing, it won't be accurate, it won't go where it's intended, because as the force is produced, that canoe will move in the water due to a lack of stability. Same idea. If we are trying to do a vertical jump, we need a stable base underneath us. If our feet are moving on the surface, we will not be able to apply the force as effectively and be able to jump as high. So this concept of stability is very, very important, and the body's center of gravity is one of the crucial things underpinning our ability to create stability. The center of gravity is a theoretical point within the human body. It's the point through which the entire weight of an object acts in a downwards fashion. And what's worth remembering is that that point doesn't necessarily have to be within the object itself. So for example, a hula hoop, because of its shape, the center of gravity will be directly in the middle of the space at the center of the hoop. Center of mass is often confused with center of gravity, but there is a slight difference there. Okay, center of mass is the point at which around which all of the body's mass is distributed. However, center of mass and center of gravity are so close together within the body that they can and often are used totally interchangeably. So don't worry too much about that terminology today. In regular shapes, center of mass lies at the total geometric center of that object. So if we had a football, center of mass would be directly in the middle of that ball. Okay? If we had a cube, right in the middle of that. The human body, however, is irregular and it changes shape. We have the ability to move our body parts, and this will cause shifts in center of mass. But center of mass can be found by experimentation. Because it is the point at which all mass is evenly distributed around it, it's also a balance point. So via experimentation and lying individuals down on a balance board, we can locate specifically where the center of mass is. Now, generally speaking, it's been found in men to be approximately 57% of their height, and in women slightly lower at about 55% of the height. But obviously this will be different per individual based around how their body mass is distributed in the body. And this certainly explains why the centre of mass is generally a little bit higher in men than in women. This is to do with where body mass is found. Men tend to have a greater degree of muscle mass around the chest and shoulders. Women have greater muscle mass in the lower limbs and certainly carry a higher degree of sex characteristic body fat around the hips and legs. Now, like I say, depending upon the individual and their body composition, this will change. So if somebody is extremely top heavy in the classic Johnny Bravo layout with an upper body like a Dorito, great big broad shoulders and chest coming into a tiny waist, and then potentially very skinny legs at the bottom. I'll say it now before you all think it, like myself. There would probably be a much higher centre of mass. Okay. If somebody carries a lot of body fat, particularly around the stomach, hips and thighs, centre of mass would be brought down. We can also cause a shift in centre of mass by moving our body around. So if we crouch down, centre of mass moves down with us. If we raise our arms above our heads, centre of mass will move up. So understanding that centre of mass isn't stable, that it is dynamic depending upon the position of our body, is very, very important for thinking about how we can manipulate it to benefit sport and performance. One final thing to note as well is when the human athlete is holding another object, we would treat centre of mass of the entire system. So for example, thinking about your presentations, if we are performing a back squat, where we're placing a barbell across the shoulders with a large amount of weight, centre of mass of that whole system, athlete plus barbell, is going to rise a lot higher because we've placed a lot more mass at the very top end of the body. So we need to treat them as a whole. The high jump gives us a really, really nice example of how we can manipulate centre of gravity, centre of mass, to allow better sporting performance. Now, historically, the high jump was performed in a number of different techniques, a sort of forwards dive, a scissor kick technique, and then there was a time in sort of athletics history when this new technique was utilised. This was called the Fosbury flop. Now, the Fosbury flop was first used by an athlete called Dick Fosbury. All right, this is why the technique's been named after him. And this was in 1968 Summer Olympics in Mexico City, where Dick Fosbury first utilised this new technique, the Fosbury flop. And in order to do that, or by doing that, he was able to jump significantly higher and win the gold medal. Okay. This technique has since proved to be so successful that this is now standard technique in high jump, and everybody does it. Okay. Now, the reason why the Fosbury flop is able to allow athletes to jump much, much higher is because within this technique, the centre of gravity never has to cross over the bar. The athlete arranges their body parts and transitions them into positions to ensure that centre of gravity remains below the bar at all times. So if you look at the picture, you can see the arch in the body is created, that when the head and shoulders have crossed over the bar, the legs are still below the bar on the other side. This arched position then results centre of gravity being in the direct centre of that, which is shown by the red point on the picture. So centre of gravity actually sails underneath the bar, which means the athlete can actually get higher up over it. Okay? So one example of where manipulating centre of gravity can really, really help sport and performance. And we'll come to a few more concepts like this a little bit later on. As mentioned at the very beginning, stability is crucial in sport. Okay, stability defined as a resistance to movement, both in terms of linear and angular fashion. And the ability for someone to assume and maintain a stable position is what we think about with balance. So in many, many instances, athletes need to maintain stability in order to succeed. So, for example, again, thinking about your presentations, if I believe it's still correct, one group using a squat, someone using a deadlift. If we're going to successfully lift that bar in an upwards direction, we need to have a stable base underneath it. If not, the bar isn't going to move. You know, the first picture on today's presentation was amateur wrestling. You're trying to remove the stability of the opponent to win, you know, take them off their feet. So many, many sport scenarios need that. And again, like I said, with the cannon and the canoe scenario, if we're going to apply force successfully, we need a stable base underneath it. If an object is highly stable, even when we apply some degree of force to it, it will return to or remain in the same position and it won't be shifted. The more quickly it returns to its position, the more stable it is. If it is unstable, the application of the force will move it from that starting position. And there are a number of factors that influence the stability of an object. And that object can indeed be a person. And for most of our examples, it will be. So stability depends upon the base, so the area of that object in contact with the floor. It depends upon the height of that object and also on the weight of that object. And the very last point on there, the very, very classic idea that we have, and we hear this mentioned in many, many sporting situations by commentators, is how a low center of gravity is very, very important to stability. A low center of gravity with a large base would be even more stable. A low center of gravity with a large base and a heavy weight would make it even more stable again. The three diagrams on screen now illustrate stability and instability in a very, very simple object. But we can apply these ideas of base, height, and weight in all these situations. So, far left, very stable object. We've got this rectangle stood on one end. The red dot illustrates the center of gravity, and the arrow coming down signifies the line of action of center of gravity. So that is the pull of that object's weight into the ground. What can be noted with that initial object is that the line of gravity falls directly within the base of support, so the bottom of the rectangle. As long as the line of gravity lands within the base, that object is stable. Okay, it's not going to fall over on its own. All right. If we made that object taller, center of gravity would move up, but the line of gravity would still land within the base, so it's still going to be stable. Okay. If we move to the middle picture, we've got the same rectangle. This time we can imagine a force has been applied from left to right, pushing the object up onto one corner. However, this is still a stable position. If the force is removed, that rectangle will return back to standing on its end in a still position. Now, this happens because, again, you can see the black arrow, that line of gravity coming down from the center of gravity, that is still within the base. Okay? As long as that arrow still lands in the base, the object will return to standing still. And you can do this with loads of household objects. You know, if you get a chair, you can tilt it one direction, let go, it'll return to all four legs. You can tilt it a bit further, it'll still return to all four legs. If you tilt it that little bit further, you'll get to a point where it will fall in the opposite direction. That's the point at which that
line of gravity has moved outside of the base, outside of the points in contact that would have been in contact with the floor. If we can get an object past that point, it becomes unstable and it will fall from where it was. And that's what we can see in the third diagram on the right hand side. In this situation, the force applied from left to right has pushed that rectangle into such a position where the line of gravity now falls outside of the base. This is the situation now where even if we took that force away, that rectangle would fall on its side. It wouldn't go back to standing. Now, if we make the rectangles taller, the centre of gravity will move upwards. We would not then have to push it as far for that line of gravity to fall outside the base. So it becomes more unstable. Let's say, take for example, we've got a lot of fans of energy drinks in the room. You get a nice big can of Monster, you get a can of, let's say, just a standard 330 can of Coke. You wouldn't have to tip that can of Monster as far to make it fall over as you would your standard can of Coke. Okay, it's taller, it's heavier, but the centre of gravity is going to be higher, which means that line of gravity will fall outside the base with less movement applied, and it will tip. Okay, same idea if we take a couple of individuals from the group. Say myself, 6'3", my centre of gravity is going to be higher. So if I'm stood with my feet together, it's not going to require as much of a push to topple me to the side and fall over as it would, for example, George, who is much shorter than me. Okay, and so that all of a sudden becomes something we can apply in a sport scenario. The base, for example, if we made these rectangles wider, the base would be bigger, and therefore it would be more stable. It would require a much bigger displacement, a much bigger push to get that black arrow falling outside the base and toppling over than it would compared to this one. If we have a heavier object, the centre of mass, also the centre of gravity, height isn't going to change, but what we have then suddenly got is a bigger inertia. So this is going to go back to Newton's laws. We're going to require a larger amount of force to push that object over. So again, three really important things that are going to influence stability. The base, the wider the base, the better, because it's going to take bigger movement to get the line of gravity outside of that base and make it tip. The height of the object, shorter objects will have a lower centre of gravity and therefore be more stable. And then the weight of an object. The heavier an object is, the bigger force is going to be required to move it. So based upon our discussions there, we know that tall people tend to be unstable because their centre of gravity is higher and can be moved out of the base with an application of force. Shorter, heavier people are more stable because their centre of gravity therefore becomes lower and it is much harder to move it out of that base of support. So what I'd like you to do is have a little think about sports where you think it is beneficial to have a low centre of gravity. Sumo wrestling, one such example where stability is really, really important. So this low centre of gravity becomes really, really crucial to them. The whole purpose of performance in sumo is to either knock the opponent off their feet or push them out of the ring within which the match takes place. A very stable individual is going to be difficult to knock over or move, and they manipulate centre of gravity accordingly. In preparation, sumo wrestlers put on as much weight as they possibly can. Okay, bigger weight increases stability because more force is required to move it. But also, you'll note, sumo wrestlers don't put on weight like bodybuilders do. We're not looking at giant pecs and traps and deltoids. We're looking at a lot of weight being added as body fat. So it's going on around the midsection and below, okay, as we can see with these gents and the nabbies on screen. Now, this therefore means a lot of mass is being carried in the lower half of the body. This pulls center of gravity down further and therefore makes them more stable. The picture on screen also shows a really nice example of what these two individuals are doing to make them more stable as well. You'll note that they both have a really wide stance. By doing that, they're increasing the size of the base. So to be pushed over, their sort of line of gravity is going to have to pushed a long way before it falls out of that base of support. Next thing, neither man is standing up straight. They're both in this sort of partial squat position. This is bringing center of gravity further down towards the ground. Okay. And the third and final thing they're doing in there is they are leaning forward towards the opponent. This moves center of gravity forwards towards the front foot. This is a perfect scenario for these individuals because they do not want to be pushed backwards. Therefore, they are very stable in a sort of in a position opposite to where they want to be or where they don't want to be. So to get this person moving backwards, they're going to have to shift that center of gravity and push it a long way back. The utilization of these body techniques to improve stability is a very important point that is utilized in a number of sports. So again, we could add in here, just to emphasize that they put on weight in the lower part of the body to bring center of gravity down. They've taken a very wide stance to increase the size of the base of the support. They're in this partial squat to again bring center of gravity down, all of which has improved stability. And then because they do not want to be moving backwards, they've leant forwards to bring center of gravity much closer to the front foot. Football, another example where a low center of gravity can be important, and particularly when dribbling. And this is one of those things you hear commentators mention a lot. So an individual with a low center of gravity is going to be very difficult to knock off the ball. And what I would mention is this is obviously very dynamic stability also. So they're not assuming a static position, not just stood, feet on the ground and trying to be knocked over. They're doing this on the move. So your classic example, Diego Maradona as a short, very good dribbler. Lionel Messi would be the modern day comparison there. Short individual, low center of gravity. It means they become very tough to knock off a ball and create instability. Boxing might be another example where a low center of gravity can be useful, but I wouldn't say it's all important in this scenario. Any sort of sport and situation where you're trying to knock an opponent over, a lower center of gravity is going to be useful to do so. Okay. The downside in boxing is there are benefits from being tall in terms of reach. So being able to manipulate center of gravity at key points to lower it when required to help brace and prevent being knocked over is going to be important in this scenario. And whilst there are many more examples where that low center of gravity can be important, the last one we'll mention is rugby. Again, similar to the football idea of dribbling, we've got a dynamic situation where a player is running, opponents trying to knock them over or at least stop them moving forwards, and keeping a low center of gravity should enable them to have some degree of dynamic stability and make it much more difficult for opponents to knock them over. And this will lead us very nicely into a discussion about tackling in sort of rugby and other sports like that, rugby union, rugby league, American football, and how knowledge of center of gravity can make tackles more or less effective. So, diagram has two different tackling techniques in play. On the left hand side we have a low tackle where force is applied to the legs below the center of mass, And on the right hand side, we have a higher tackle where the force is applied directly at the level of centre of mass to the middle of the body. So the big question is, which one of these will be more successful in terms of knocking over the player running with the ball? Hopefully, your answer was the low tackle on the left-hand side, because that should be the one that will be more successful. Tackling low, below the centre of gravity, should cause the legs to rotate around the centre of mass. So effectively taking away the base of support. The centre of gravity then falls outside the base of support, and the ball carrying player will fall over or be knocked over unless they can take some sort of evasive action. And for anyone who's played rugby, this is how you're taught to tackle. You put the shoulder into the thigh, and then even more ideally, you wrap your arms around the legs and hug them tight. So you pin those two legs together, you make the base of support even smaller, and the individual becomes less stable. With the higher tackle on the right hand side, when we apply a force directly to the centre of gravity, what we probably just end up doing then is shifting it laterally. So we may knock this ball carrying player sideways, but not necessarily knock them over. They're also free to be able to adjust their base of support in that situation and maintain stability as a result. If we think about those tackles now from the opposite point of view, the person carrying the ball, what action can be taken to try and improve stability before impact? Number 25 here in the picture is obviously trying to run forwards towards the end zone to try and score. Number 98 is tackling him. Number 25 does not want to be tackled, so he's going to have to try and make himself more stable so he can take that impact and keep moving forward. All right. So take a little moment and think, what things might number 25 be able to do to make himself more stable? Okay, some of these things we mentioned before, particularly when discussing the sumo wrestler. So if we remember, three major things impact upon stability. We have height, we have the base, and we have the mass or the weight. All right. So this player isn't going to be able to change their body mass at this point. You know, you might think season upon season he could take action if he knows his ability to break a tackle is tough. He could spend a lot of time lifting and developing body mass, particularly mass around the lower extremities. But in a dynamic situation like a game, mass is stable. So that's not going to be able to change. So we have to think about height and base. All right. First of all, he can't make himself taller or shorter, but what he can do is manipulate his body position to change the height of center of gravity. So he can get lower to the ground. That's going to make him more stable. Center of gravity gets lower, and in that situation, center of gravity has to be shifted a lot further to fall outside of the base. Second thing he can do is manipulate that base itself. In the picture right now, he's not in contact with the floor at all, which makes him extremely unstable. So we need to establish contact with the ground. All right. 1 foot will not be particularly stable. If we can get 2 feet on the ground, we're going to be a little more stable. We can then think about where we position those feet. So if he takes a nice wide stance as that tackle comes, he's going to be more stable and in a better position to resist the force applied by the defending player. In addition, he may lean into the tackle by taking a sort of a lateral lunge towards the player. This is going to shift centre of gravity towards the area of impact, and again that's going to mean centre of gravity is going to have to be shifted much further for it to go out of the base of support. One additional thing with regards to base that could be done is create even more additional points of contact. So if he placed a spare hand on the ground, we've now got a bigger base. Okay. If you think about it, if you lie flat on the ground, it's probably the most stable you can be. You know, really large base of support on the ground. Not necessarily effective for sporting situations, but if we're just talking pure stability. So again, to improve stability, individuals can manipulate the height of their centre of gravity by taking a sort of partial squat. They can manipulate the size of their base of support and can change the position of centre of gravity in relation to that base of support. So far we've discussed making yourself more stable, but in sport, is it ever beneficial to be unstable? The pictures that appeared on screen now show situations where we are very close to being unstable at any given point. A sprint start, a start from the blocks in swimming, and a line of scrimmage in American football. So what's worth considering is, what do those situations all have in common? What I'm thinking about there is those situations all involve a scenario in which the individual needs to go from not moving at all to moving as fast as possible, as quick as possible. So we're in need of rapid acceleration. So what all these individuals have done is created a position where we can go from stability to instability in an instant. Okay. If we want to move, we have to be unstable. Remember, stability could be defined as this resistance to linear and angular forces, which are creating movement. Okay. So if we want to accelerate, we have to be unstable. We want it to be easy to get moving, not hard to get moving. So all these positions put the athlete in a situation where if they remove part of their base of support, the body will start moving very quickly. So if we take just a quick example, sprint start in the top left, we've got those 4 points of contact. The legs are partially extended, putting the hips in the air, and the weight is pushing forwards. If that sprinter removes their hands from the ground, they'll fall forward on their face. Extremely unstable. But if they remove those hands from the ground and combine that with a powerful extension from hips, knees and ankles, that'll drive the body forward very quickly. Same idea with the swimmer. He wants to dive forward into the water as soon as possible. So he can just shift very slightly forward and he'll fall. You know, you see that all the time when there's a false start in swimming. Many of those swimmers fall forward off the blocks anyway. They're in such a delicate position of stability versus instability that it's tough to maintain. Same idea with American footballers. Whoever explodes forward the fastest with the most power is going to overcome the player on the other side. So we need to get in a position where we can shift very quickly. So when we require fast movement, we need to be as unstable as possible without negating good technique. Just to finish off then, a quick look at movements I know people are considering or have definitely decided upon for their presentations. The deadlift and the squat, and how centre of gravity and stability relates to these. So in both situations we go, centre of gravity will move throughout. At the bottom of the lift, centre of gravity will be very low because we go into this crouched down position. As we stand, centre of gravity rises up. So stability will change accordingly. However, because centre of gravity is only moving in this vertical position, we shouldn't really be in danger of losing stability. You know, it's not going to move outside of those feet. So we're certainly not going to fall in a side-to-side manner. However, poor technique might result in centre of gravity moving either behind the heels or in front of the toes. Okay. If we think again, what I mentioned earlier in this presentation, that when a human athlete is holding a barbell in this situation, we have to treat the mass of the entire system, so the person and the barbell, and the position of centre of mass, centre of gravity changes accordingly. So within the deadlift, because the bar is held in front of the body, centre of gravity is going to shift forwards. Okay, this shouldn't really be too much of a concern. It should still land within the space of those feet. Okay. However, if technique suffers, this could be a problem. We should, in a deadlift, never get in the situation where we lose stability in a backwards situation. We shouldn't fall backwards because, you know, that additional weight is pulling us forwards. Proper deadlift technique involves pulling that bar pretty much straight up the shins, up the thighs to waist height. That's why you see so many deadlifters with bleeding shins, because they're dragging the knurling of the bar up the shin, scrape it all up, but that's showing good technique. If that bar starts too far forward and there's too much space between the bar and the shins, centre of gravity is also going to be pulled forward, and we have a danger of stability being lost in that situation, and that athlete could be pulled forwards. With the squat, the bar is placed on the back of the body, so centre of gravity is being shifted backwards. So we do have to be careful that centre of gravity does not go beyond the heels at the back, because it will then be outside that base of support and will have that person topple backwards. One of the problems we may have technique-wise in the squat is, as somebody gets into the bottom position, they may fold forwards, is what we say. To paint that picture, bend right over from the hips. Okay, chest comes down too low, almost parallel to the floor. All of a sudden there, because of the position of that barbell, centre of gravity is way forward, and if that crosses in front of the toes, the individual can faceplant. And once that goes too far, it is very, very difficult to get out of that position, particularly if the barbell is heavily loaded. Okay, so a couple of things, a couple of ways you might want to consider about how to incorporate the information from today into your presentations.